Hello and welcome to episode 198 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. There are almost 200 episodes there, so please do go and check those out if you haven't already, because there's bound to be some writers or indeed agents or editors that you want to hear from. This week is a special episode because it is a recording of our live show that we did at Cymera Festival this year, which is...
Wait, when did we do that? I don't remember getting an invite.
Yeah, I forgot to invite you, Tarek. No, you decided you were too busy, so I did this. Yes, Cymera is Edinburgh's sci-fi, fantasy and horror festival. They get great authors there every year, and this year we were lucky enough to do a recording with Mark Lawrence. And I say we, but it was actually only me because Tarek didn't turn up.
Marco gave me the wrong location and the wrong date and time.
So yeah, it was recorded before a live podcast. So it's the biggest we have ever had, and I'm pretty sure that's
until
because
that's
you weren't
independently verified. I'll just assume you're just telling total bullshit.
But no, obviously brilliant having the opportunity to speak with Mark Lawrence, who's one of the leading fantasy writers. He's written many great trilogies of books, and we talk about fantasy's obsession with trilogies. In the current series that he's writing just now is the Library series, the second book of which is out at the moment. The third one I think is out next year. But it was really interesting hearing from Mark how he got into writing, and also why he wanted to start the self-published fantasy blog off, which is a competition for self-published writers. Essentially he did that to try and help other writers up the ladder, as it were, and draw some attention to them, because there are so many books being published these days that it can be very difficult to stand out. And some great names and authors have come through that competition as well, so it obviously works. But we will get straight into the interview, and I hope you're going to enjoy listening to it, Tarek, especially you, and learning a few techniques about how to do a good interview. But we'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our Writer's Notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat when you can tell me what you thought, Tarek, and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, I'm unplugging my microphone. I'm not going to listen to this out of protest. On with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realise it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for another special live episode of Page One at Chimera, which is becoming a bit of a tradition. This is by far the busiest it's ever been, which makes me slightly nervous as I'm normally accompanied by Tarek, but as I was saying before we started recording, you've lucked out because it's the better half of the podcast today with you. Of course, can't go a Page One episode without mentioning our notebooks, which are for sale in the Creators Hall, but for today only at a very special price. So that's where you want to be headed after this. But of course, the reason you're really here is because we have a very special guest. We're joined by the brilliant Mark Lawrence, critically acclaimed and award-winning author of trilogies such as The Broken Empire, Book of Ancestor, and many more. His latest series is the Library series, with the second instalment, The Book That Broke the World, just recently out. Before I dive in, I will say that there will be a Q&A at the end, so get thinking of some good questions to ask Mark at the end. But, Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for asking for me.
Regular listeners will know I always start the podcast with the same question, which is, did you always want to be a writer?
So I, before agreeing to come on your podcast, listened to last year's interview with R.J. Barker, who is a guy with bags of personality and is very good at entertaining and very interesting. And I heard him say many things, one of which was that he wanted to be a rock star.
Yes.
Which gives you the sort of contrast between our personalities, because this is about as public as I would ever get. But I also listened to all the other questions, and although we're very different people, he gave exactly the same answer that I would give to all of those questions. So if anyone was here for that, you're going to get a rerun. Because,
excellent. Okay. Well, yeah, I have varied the questions up slightly, so hopefully.
Okay. But the answer to the question is absolutely no. I had no ambitions to be a writer, and really I didn't have any ambitions to be a published author pretty much up until the point I was. So when I was a lad, I read lots of fantasy, but I was very much on the science path, and that was the job I did, was a research scientist. And I read these fantasy books and other books, and I always felt that there's no way I could write this, so that it seemed like impossibly far. It seemed like, you're watching, Russian gymnasts on the Olympics, and you're thinking, well, I'm not going to go out in the garden and start doing cartwheels because that's never going to happen. And it felt the same to me. It felt like I can't see a way in which you can just start writing stuff and you'll get what's on the page there. In later life, because I'd done a lot of creative things, like I played D&D as a kid, and I ran a play-by-mail fantasy game between university and my PhD. I'd done a lot of sort of writing of fantasy, even though it wasn't in a sort of typical story form, and I just enjoyed doing it. So I got into writing short stories in online groups, and those got longer, and it turned into one book and then another. But I never thought of these as seriously, objects that someone was going to publish. They were simply entertaining sort of 5 or 10 people that I was sharing them with on these critique groups. And there was a lady who lives in America, and she sent me this writer's manual that had all of these markets for writing in, and all this sort of stuff about these agents and that agent. And it was a big fat tome, and to send something from the States is really expensive, and she wasn't by any means wealthy. So I knew she had made a huge investment to send me this thing, and it made me feel so guilty that I acted on it. And I thought, well, okay, I'll write to a few agents so I can tell her that I tried, but I didn't expect anything to come of it. And
something did come of it.
They said yes. I literally wrote to 4, and 2 of them sent me the form rejections. I was 5, I think, and 2 of them sent me. 2 of them never replied, so I'm still waiting to see what they think. And one of them said, "Yeah, this is exactly what I'm looking for. I'll take you on." And
here you are.
Here I am.
Yeah, amazing. And was that then what you were sending out? Then was that Prince of Thorns, or was it something different?
Yeah, that was Prince of Thorns.
Was fantasy, you said you played D&D and stuff when you were younger and stuff. Was fantasy always the thing that drew you towards it and the thing that you wanted to write about?
Yeah, I mean, I always, my dad read a lot of science fiction, so I read his sci-fi books, but they always seemed very dry to me. Sci-fi always seemed to be about the big idea, and the characters were very flat, sort of, and there wasn't a lot of emotion, whereas fantasy, it sort of really drew you in, and you sort of got your heart pumping. And my mother read me Lord of the Rings when I was about 7 years old, and kind of hooked. So yeah, it's always been fantasy for me. But people always say, you're a professional scientist, why didn't you write sci-fi? And the answer is, well, I actually have written some sci-fi, and most of my books are kind of sci-fi in disguise, but swords and dragons rather than ray guns and spaceships.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's speculative. So yeah, it's the old Star Wars is a fantasy story about with space wizards and things like that. But
pretty much.
So since Prince of Thorns came out, which obviously launched you in a big way, you've been extremely prolific. I was looking at all the especially the years in which you published. I mean, what is how do you produce so much? Do you have a process that has been honed over time, or have you always just followed the same path?
No, I'm one of these annoying people when people ask me for sort of writing advice, because when people ask for writing advice, they tend to want you to tell them a set of things to do, and I avoid that like the plague, primarily because I know lots of, say, successful writers, and they all have completely different methods, and so it's ridiculous to go out and tell someone you must plan, or you must do this, or you must do that. But also, what I do is so hard, you can't constructively describe it. I just sit down, start typing, don't have a plan, bang, book, and that's no use to anybody who wants to write their own book. So yeah, there's really not much of a process there, and I think the reason I'm able to put out a book a year and sometimes more, I was having this conversation on the stairs with Christina over there, is simply because I think a lot of people, when they write something and they read it and they go, oh, that's terrible, and they feel really bad about it, and they beat themselves up, and then they come back to it 10 times and mash it around and try and feel happier about it. And either it's a function of my size of my ego, or how easily I am pleased, that I tend to write something, I say, yeah, that's pretty good, and I'll send it off to my agent, and I have in the past tried to change things I've written, but then I have 2 versions, and I'm unable to say this one's better than that one. It just feels like, I guess, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It doesn't really matter whether I move this paragraph or delete that one. So I can't tell if it's any better. So I just stick with what I do the first time. And if somebody else, like my beta reader or my publisher, says, this bit really needs changing, then okay, I'll go and change it. But that doesn't happen that much. So and that's, I guess, my productivity. It's not that I write an enormous number of words per day. It's just the words that I write tend to stay there until the book comes out.
And you say you don't have a process. So I'm assuming as well that means you don't sit down at the start and sort of plan it out or anything. But what with your stories comes first? Is it the idea of an event, a plot, or is it the characters? What comes first to you?
Well, I mean, I make it up as I go. And some of my books, I've just literally had no idea. I've just started typing a page, and embarrassingly, it's a bit like the mechanic behind AI, which is essentially a glorified predictive text, where it just says, what's the most likely thing to follow it? And that's kind of what I do, is I write something and I say, what will happen next? And I just keep on asking, what if, what next? And I get to a place. But sometimes I have more of a feeling about the book's going to be about, but it's typically more about who the character is than what's going to happen. Right. So I don't know, like the Book of the Ancestor, which is one where I had a couple of ideas to start with, and one was that I'd been talking to Peter B. Brett, who wrote the Demon Cycle, and in his books, these demons just come out of the ground every night and give everyone a hard time, and everyone has to hide. And that's the sort of he described it as, this is the pressure I exert on my characters so that something interesting happens, because writing is typically you have a character, put them under a lot of stress, the walls in their room close down and the spikes come out, and in that extremis something interesting happens, like they solve the problem, or their character reveals new depths to itself or something. And his advice was the demons, and mine was, I thought, well, that's a nice image. How about a literal device that's closing? And so I had an ice planet with a corridor, an ice-free corridor around the equator, and these big walls of ice to either side of it, which are inching forwards. So now I've got that continual pressure on not only the characters themselves, but the society they're in. And I thought that would be interesting, because if you keep squeezing, something's got to happen.
Yeah.
And then I also came up with a few character traits for the main character and said, that sounds interesting. I'll dump her into this and see what happens. And that's literally the plan I had.
When we've spoken to people like yourself that say that they literally just sit down and write and sort of, as they say, and pants it out essentially, but does there come a process, does there come a time in the writing where, although yes, as you say, it's like an LLM, what word comes next, is a part of your brain always thinking, right, actually, where is this going? Where is this coalescing into something?
So I get this reaction where you say, I make it up as I go along and I really don't know what's going to happen next. And people say, well, that's not possible, because, you must have some sort of... And the way I liken it is, when you read the book, so let's say you're 10 chapters into this book, you've got some ideas about what's happening in the next chapter. If the characters are going to have this conflict with some baddie, or if they are going to this city, or if they're taking this voyage, you'll have some ideas as a reader about what's going to happen next. But you're not planning that book, you just have opinions about what might happen next. You've got a range of them. And that's kind of the situation I'm in, where, I'm 10 chapters in, and it's not like I've got no idea what's going to happen on the next page. I've got those general feelings about these things might happen. But when you bang two characters together, they're quite complex beasts, and all manner of things can happen. So, and it's very hard to predict. And so the ideas and the directions often materialize on the page as you go. And I've started going to board games clubs. So I've got into these board games. And when I was a lad, when you played a board game, you would roll dice, and the randomness of the game would come from the result of the dice, and so you wouldn't know who was going to win. But these days, board games tend to have an enormously complex set of rules, and the rules are so complicated that there's essentially no way you can predict what's going to happen as a consequence of your strategy that you're going to employ. So they've replaced the dice with just complexity, and book writing's a bit like that, where you have a complex dynamic situation, and all manner of things could happen. Mm-hmm. And as you just push it forwards, I find myself falling into one path or another, which I find much more interesting, because if I was to plan it out ahead of time, just kill the whole thing for me, I would no longer be interested in writing the book, because I know what was going to happen, and it's not exciting. And a lot of writers do plan it out, and they know exactly what's going to happen, and they just fill in, they've got a one-page plan, and they turn that into a one-page per chapter plan, then they turn that into a 3-page per chapter plan, and then they just start filling in between the lines, and it works brilliantly for some, and they write excellent books. But me, I would lose the will to live. I would just never finish the book.
And I mean, I can probably guess what you're going to say here, but in that writing of the book, and sort of, as you're writing it, finding out what's going to happen and stuff, do you ever get into a position where you find yourself in a corner where you think, oh, well, this path that's gone down, I can't see a way out of it? Or is it just a case that you'll always just find a way out of it because of the way that you write?
I'm always finding myself in a corner, which is what makes it interesting. But I'm never worried that I won't find a way out of the corner, because I'm God. Like, I can bend reality to make it work.
Podcast exclusive.
So I sometimes see people go, when they're critiquing books online, and they say, oh, this guy obviously not necessarily me, but this guy obviously wrote himself into a corner here, and they might say that about George R. R. Martin. They might say, oh, he's slowed down because he's written himself into a corner. No, that's not true for me, at least, and I doubt it's true for anybody else, because there are so many levers that an author can pull. You find we're in this business because we get lots of ideas, and people who aren't authors often come to you and say, I've got a great idea. And every writer tells this story where I'll give you this great idea and I'll get 50% of the money and you just write the book. But authors are not short of ideas. They have too many ideas. And it's those ideas that get you out of corners. So no, never feel that I'm in a hole and I can't get out of it.
And what you're describing there about how you write your books, I think, resonates with the way that when I've read your books, that they're very much books that drop you in at the start, and they, there isn't a lot of exposition or whatever at the start of the book. You have to find your way with the characters, as it were. Is that just a consequence of that method, do you think?
I mean, it sounds plausible, but I feel the reason I do it that way is simply because I don't enjoy books where I get a huge info dump and the person spends a long time explaining stuff to me that I'm not yet emotionally invested in. So I feel, maybe rightly or maybe wrongly, because I'm sure there are readers for these sort of info dump books, but I feel I need to give the reader a reason to care before I start taking them to school and educating him. Because if you just start writing about some made-up land and the made-up problems they've got and the made-up politics and the made-up religions, and nobody cares, it's just random nonsense. Unless you've got actual people in there with real problems that you start to become emotionally invested in, then they don't care about, the shape of your islands or the fact that, corn isn't growing very well over here. It's just, but some people, certainly writers, when they're starting along and trying to write stories, sometimes they get confused and they'll think what I need to do is lay out all of this instruction beforehand. But no, that's just going to make people, in my experience, make people turn away.
It's almost like, going back to the sort of game analogy, in a fantasy game setting like Dungeons and Dragons or something, you have exactly that, don't you? You have the manual that says this is what the world's like, this is what the cities are like, this is the currency, and it's all laid out. And I think maybe what can happen when people write sometimes is that if they're coming from something like that, they think all of that information is the most important stuff that they need to get right first.
I think if you look at Lord of the Rings, which is a classic example where, many people, there's this sort of thing that every writer wants you to feel that there's an enormous depth behind everything, that behind every door there's rooms and people and story. And so it's like this iceberg thing where your book's the tip of the iceberg and there's all this depth behind it. And actually what most writers end up doing is more like the sort of set in a Western where it's these facades, and if you go into the saloon, you're just round the back and there's struts supporting it. Because you don't have 20 years like Tolkien did to sort of create this massive edifice of a world and invent languages for it and all of that. So you try and give people the impression of that being there without it actually being there. And so people ask me questions about a minor character or something and say, what did they do after this? I have no idea. Well, where did they come from? I have no idea. Until I write something down, I haven't decided. I keep it fluid, which is how I get out of the holes, because it's not fixed. Yeah. But so Tolkien, he had this edifice of a world in his mind, and he'd probably written loads of it down, and people will come along and they'll read the Silmarillion and they'll think, ooh, he's constructed this. So what I need to do is construct this great big world. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, but if it makes them happy, they do it. But Tolkien didn't then shove this down your throat. He didn't publish the Silmarillion. He wrote a story about hobbits doing interesting things and starting off very small. And, a wizard comes to call and it builds and it builds. He gave you a reason to care. He didn't sort of open up with, these are the basics of Elvish and this is what's happening in Mordor and this is the economy of Gone. No, he just got you involved on a personal level.
And, well, I suppose linked to that is that, especially when you're writing trilogies like you do, the world and the people, the characters grow, I suppose. And how do you, especially with the way that you write, where you don't have that sort of Bible or whatever, how do you keep track of everything in your mind? Or is it just a case of you sort of know how you've got there, so you just follow the path to where it leads?
I mean, I'm an enthusiast, so it doesn't matter how enthusiastic you are as a reader reading the book. I've lived an entire year with the book being, since I became full-time at least, essentially all I do. So it never has seemed any effort at all for me to remember a handful of characters and what's happened, because I've spent all this time doing it. It just doesn't, it seems a non-question to me. I mean, I can understand from the other side of the page when you've just spent a few days with this book and you think, oh, how did he remember all this stuff? But, I've done this for a year, I've built this up, and it's not going to just sort of pop out of my mind. So, I just remember it. I don't keep any notes. And, if I really get stuck for what colour someone's hair was, I just sort of do a word search and find out, but it doesn't tend to happen.
And so latest book is, as I said at the start, the second book in the library series, The Book That Broke the World. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that in case people haven't read it?
I mean, I'm probably contractually obliged to. I'm always very hesitant to say anything about my book. I do not do elevator pictures. It's weird because you'd think that a lot of authors are very keen to tell you about their books. In fact, over keen, some of them, and they will start feeding you the whole story. I am super anti-spoiler, so I very rarely, and I insist as far as I can on writing the blurbs on the back of my book and ensure they say almost nothing. They just give you a sort of feel for the sort of emotional content and vibe of the thing. And the publishers always used to be saying, oh, shouldn't we tell them that he goes here and does that? And I'm going, no, we shouldn't. We should just put some nice writing, and they'll say, oh, this author has written some nice writing, let's read the book. But with the library trilogy, what I do like to talk about, well, like's too strong a word, what I will talk about is the origins and the themes involved. So it's about a library, an enormous library, and one of the reasons I wanted to write about a library is because they turn up in fantasy books surprisingly often, because authors like libraries. And you can all remember books where someone's slapped in a really big library, like Shadow of the Torturer. There's a big library in there, and in Senlin Ascends, there's a big library, and there's a big library in Strange the Dreamer. I wanted to write my own big library. Plus, my mother, when we came back, I was born in America and came back very young. Her first job was as a librarian, and so she would take me to work, and I was like 2 or 3 years old. And so some of my earliest memories are being very small in a reasonably big, sort of reasonably old-fashioned library, and it made an impression, because you're sort of looking up at all this stuff, and when you're 2 years old, it's very easy to think the thing's essentially infinite. So I wanted to capture that vibe, put it on the page. But it also seemed like my books are not literary fiction, though this trilogy is probably the closest to literary fiction that I have come, and I do like them to have some elements of literary fiction. I like them to have some themes and some sort of slightly deeper thoughts underlying. So I hope people can read all of them as a sort of run away and don't die and we're falling. But also I like people to be able to think about them a bit more deeply if they want to, and consider the what's being said at a slightly deeper level. And in the library trilogy, it seemed like a nice way to be able to talk about a lot of quite current issues that face society, which is the library is essentially a stand-in for the internet. It's a resource of essentially infinite knowledge. And so we get to discuss the difference between information and wisdom. We get to think about whether if you have access to all of the information that's ever existed, should you really have that information? I mean, libraries are a good thing, and I encourage people to go to them, but the libraries we have in our society, we've decided not to put the recipe for napalm in, and not to tell you how to make bombs, and not to have instructions to how to construct a nuclear weapon. And in the library trilogy, the library is effectively infinite in space and time, but societies have risen and destroyed themselves, risen and destroyed themselves. And each time they destroy themselves, they can go to the library and have access potentially to that information. Is that a good idea? Because are they ready for it? And so there's not an answer to that, but there's a lot of debate about, should you give a toddler a razor blade to play with, or should you say, no, I know better than you? And how does that play out in this context?
Yeah. And as you said, it is a trilogy, and when you're starting out your stories, do you always have that in mind? Is that just a publishing thing that they like, especially in fantasy trilogies, are things that people want, or is that the natural flow and size of the story that you want to tell?
This is a question you asked R.J. Barker, and I'm going to give you exactly the same answer he gave, which is several-fold. Yes, publishers love trilogies. It's a sort of level of commitment that they can handle. They know they've got some books coming, but then if you nosedive into obscurity, they're not sort of signed up to you for 20 books. And fantasy loves series, and a trilogy is a series, because if you build a world, a playground, a magic system, there's so much effort involved in kind of educating the reader. You never want the reader to feel they're being educated, but that they are. And having put this stuff in their brain, to then go off and write, and to have that be a standalone and just go off and write another one, when that's in their brain now, let's have some fun with it. So write some more books. But then I get bored. I have an attention span, and after 3 books, I don't want to write anymore. Got lots of other ideas that I want to explore instead. So it's just a length that works for me.
And is that a line in would you ever want to say, right, I'm going to go back and I have a new story to tell in a particular world or anything like that? Or is it because, like you said, you've always got lots of ideas, you'd rather just explore the new things?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of going back. I mean, especially as one of the things discussed in the library trilogy and in the short stories associated with it is the way that you can't go back to a book, because when you go back, the act of reading that book has changed you, so you have a different experience with it. And so if you go back to a certain book repeatedly over the course of your life, maybe every 10 years, if it's a good, thoughtful book, you may come away with very different impressions of it each time as you change and as the combined experience changes. And I think that's true of writers too, that if I were to go back to The Broken Empire, that was written probably 15 years ago. I'm not the same person, and it's just not an experience. I like to leave them and say, this is finished now. I'm not going to spoil it. I sometimes feel that somebody makes something really nice, and then they're tempted to come back and do a sequel or something, and it can be a bad idea. It generally feels like it is a bad idea. It feels like they're just sort of milking the cash cow, and
yeah,
I'd rather just let them stand there.
And in terms of fantasy generally, have you? Because I think it's true of all genre fiction that in the past it has been looked down upon. But we were speaking to an agent recently on the podcast, who said that when she was working as an editor, fantasy was a tougher sell, but now suddenly it's exploded in a way that it makes the publishers a lot of money, and so suddenly there's a lot more interest in it from their point of view. Do you think that's true?
Well, there's certainly an awful lot more books published. I mean, in the 80s, if you got a publishing deal and you had a pretty decent book, you might sell millions of them and become super rich because there really wasn't that much competition. And now It's just, I think I looked up on the day that my book was going to be released, and there's like 200 other fantasy books released that same day, 200 the day before, 200 the day after. So it's certainly, yes, lots of it sells, but lots of people are trying to sell it. The looking down part, I mean, people look down on everything. I don't really have a polite answer to that. So,
We can do impolite if you want, that's fine. But
well, you know, I mean, yeah, like I say, pick a thing and there'll be someone who looks down on it for some reason. I don't think there's any intellectual basis for looking down on genre fiction. There's lots of very clever people who write it, and I don't feel someone who's decided to write literary fiction is fundamentally more intelligent or better than somebody who's writing fantasy or science fiction or anything else.
yeah, no, I think probably everyone in the room would agree with that, since we're at Chimera. So I did want to, because you mentioned this earlier, that you did touch a bit into sci-fi with, I think it was the Impossible Times books that were a bit of a change of direction. Why did you want to write those ones? Was it just something that...
Well, I mean, one thing is I keep getting really far ahead of my publishing schedule.
Right, okay.
So, like, you know, I've got the books for the next 4 years written, and do I really want to write a book that's not coming out for 5 years, or should I write something that might see the light of day more swiftly? So I've got non-compete clauses like every author has it in their contracts that say, you know, if you write another fantasy book, then your publisher wants it. You can't just go and self-publish it or do something else. And publishing industry is based on goodwill anyway, so even if it wasn't in the contract, you don't want to upset people. But if I went and wrote some science fiction, then I could maybe get that out, and it wouldn't sort of suck any sort of sales away from the fantasy book. So I thought I'd give that a shot. And it was I'd read Ready Player One, and I really enjoyed that. I didn't understand why anybody else did, because the reason I really enjoyed it was because I was that age in the 80s. I had played all of these games and these D&D modules and listened to those songs. Every single reference he made, you know, I was right there. And I'm thinking, why does someone who all this happened 20 years before they were born, what are they getting out of this book? But it sold very well. And so I thought, well, I could write a book set in the 80s too, and use my own experience of D&D. So I'd have some D&D playing people of the same sort of age I was then, and sort of project a few things from my past onto that, and then let's have some science fiction in there too.
And the other thing I wanted to ask about, I suppose adjacent to your own writing, is I'm going to get the order of this wrong probably, but the self-publishing fantasy blog of. Do you want to tell us about, first of all, what in case listeners don't know what that is, to explain what that is?
Good timing, because the 10th self-publishing fantasy blog off starts today. So
there you go, perfect.
There you go. SPFBOX. People call the SPFBO SPFBO, and if you put the X for 10 on it, it becomes SPFBOX. So it is just a self-publishing fantasy contest, and every year we have 300 books. We allow 300 books in, and they go into 10 groups, and each group is judged by a blog, which is a team or an individual, and they pick a champion out of it, and then those 10 champions go into a second phase where they are competed against each other, score table, and we find the winner, and we go hooray, and it's all designed to just generate interest in these books. So people like contests and people like scoreboards, and it get loads of reviews from the process. So it's fun, and it alerts people to books that they might not otherwise notice, because it's pretty hard to make a mark if you're traditionally published. It's even harder if you're self-published. You take away the barrier of having to beat your way into a publisher's orbit, but you then have to compete with so many other people. And because of the place I'd come from writing groups in Yahoo, I'd been in critique groups, and I'd seen all of these people. Like I did a bit of slush pile reading for a little magazine that was online magazine, and they were offering $10 if they took your story to put in their magazine online. And the number of stories that were coming in to compete for this $10, which was like 1 cent a word or something, and the quality of them was just like staggering. And so I was aware that, so part of it is I always say survivor guilt. I was aware that the place that I got wasn't like, I didn't beat my way there through merit. I always say that success in publishing, it's a bit like a lottery, and the price of the lottery ticket is you have to write a good book. But then you've just got a lottery ticket, and then you need the luck for your numbers to come up and succeed. And so I was aware that the reason I had written to those 4 agents was, and been taken on, and then had a sort of international bidding war and got a large advance and been pushed with in bookshops, and all of that was what made me. The reason for that was just the alignment of the stars, that the book I had written was by chance in the same area as Abercrombie's work, and publishers were screaming for more of it. And so, and I didn't know this, and it's not like my skill, it was just I lucked out. So that makes you think, you see all these self-published people and you think some of these books are brilliant, but nobody is reading them because there's so many. How would they find them? You know, unless you go and buy 300 self-published books and read them all yourself, you're not going to find that gem. But if we have established bloggers and YouTubers and whatnot read these for you and then say, these ones here, these are excellent, you should have a look at these, it gives people more confidence, so they'll actually go out and spend time and money on them. So that's the idea behind it.
I mean, do you think it's because obviously there is a sort of democratization, I suppose, of writing, and that's what self-publishing has given people the ability to get their stuff out there. But at the same time, as you say, there's much more stuff, both traditionally and self-published, out there. Do you think it's harder now to have that success as a writer because of the sheer numbers of people?
I think that's a very difficult question. I mean, it's always been hard, but it's hard in different ways now. And I think one thing that certainly readers may not be aware of is you could write for the best book in the world. You could, if you look at the best-selling book that's out there right now, and I don't know what it is, but you just pick the one that's at the top of the New York Times #1 fantasy list. If you wrote that book yourself and self-published it, without the stars aligning, no one would notice it. And it doesn't matter if like 4 people read it and say this is the best book I've ever read, because lots of self-published books have 4 people read them and say this is the best book I've ever read, and they all die because there's this noise floor, and you need to get above that noise floor for anyone to notice. And the publishing business is and success is a very non-linear process. It snowballs. So it's very hard to sort of ride that wave up to the sort of level of sales where you could actually pay your bills, for example. And I don't think it's widely known quite how not a meritocracy it is, quite how easy it is to write a brilliant book and just vanish entirely. And the SPFBO doesn't solve that. It just gives some people another roll of those dice, and that's the best we can do.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the library trilogy and what you said there about being way ahead of your publishing dates and stuff, I'm guessing that you've written the end of the library trilogy already. Yes.
And the first book in a trilogy that comes after that.
Well, that's what I was about to ask.
And 2 more books as well.
There you go. So rather prolific, as I said at the start. I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor now, if anyone's got any. Does anyone, hands up if you've got a question? Unfortunately, the mic didn't pick up the audience questions very well, so I'll repeat. or paraphrase the question here, which was, when you're writing such long books without a plan, how don't you get trapped in a corner?
I mean, I think it's, as I said earlier, that I just have access to so many levers that I can just change the parameters in so many subtle ways that I can escape the whole. So I'm often walking somebody into an impossible situation and I don't know how they're going to get out of it. And that's good because the reader also doesn't know how they're going to get out of it. And I rely on my ingenuity combined with the fact I can just subtly shift what's facing them until something in their character and their background and what they have with them and who they have with them will suggest a way to overcome the problem. There was one book out of all of them, which was the Liar's Key and the Red Queen's War, where it wasn't so much a problem that I'd written myself into. It was just I didn't know where it was going and how it was going to end. And that's one of my longest books because what I did was just keep on walking, keep on encountering things, and eventually the number of things in his wake conspired to construct something in front of him that would put a satisfactory ending to the story. And I think partly because many readers assume that there's all this level of planning, they project it there for you. And a lot of writing is smoke and mirrors. I say this about description, where a lot of people who are starting to write, they think the thing they need to do to describe something is to write all of the details. So, if they want to write a room and they want to make it luxurious, so they're going to start describing all the twirls and the gilding on this vase, and then the sort of chest of drawers it's on, and the wood and the polish. But really, for me, the art of description is to understand that the readers also know what's in your head, that they have seen whatever it is you're imagining, they've got some close approximation of it in their head. And what you really need is just to strike the right note that will summon that into being. So you have the reader do the heavy lifting for you. So you just need to find some efficient way of evoking that memory in them, and then they'll just paint everything else in like they do in a dream. And there's an element of that going in the storytelling that because they're assuming that it's all been worked out ahead of time, they think, oh my gosh, how clever you are to have plotted this all, from the start. But no, pieces are just falling down and I'm seeing patterns, and I'm saying, that looks a bit like a donkey.
Any other questions? And this question was from another audience member, actually a former guest of the podcast, Nicholas Binge. He asked, given that Prince of Thorns, when it came out, was rather short as fantasy books go, but each one in the series grew longer, was that a conscious decision, or was it pressure from the publisher to write longer books, or just what the story needed?
I mean, when I started writing Prince of Thorns, I didn't know it was a book. I thought it was a short story. When I finished writing it, I didn't intend there to be any more. Publishers, years later, when I sold it, said, "Oh, could this be a trilogy?" So there was no planning like that. And the length of it, again, it's more to do with my attention span than anything else. I mean, it turned out to be in a kind of sweet spot for debut novels, because the publishers don't really want to invest in big fat books and all of that expensive paper for a first book, and they don't know it's going to fly or not. They'd rather publish something around about the 100,000 word mark, and Prince of Thorns is 82,000 words. So it's not like a short book, but because it's reasonably paced and shortish, those conspire to make people think that it's perhaps shorter than it is. And the other ones, I guess, I just had a bit more time and incentive, because I wasn't writing Prince of Thorns to sell a book to a publisher. I was writing a short story on a critique group, and it just kept on getting a bit longer. And I just started off by, because I had recently reread Clockwork Orange, which stars a wholly reprehensible main character who does terrible things. And I read it and I'm thinking, how is this author, Burgess, getting me to be interested and follow this guy and sometimes even root for him when he has done terrible things? And I thought, well, it's in the first person, and that there's only one set of eyes, and you're seeing everything through that person's eyes, and that has a sort of kind of aligns you with the person, and it has a remarkable degree of strength to it. So that if you are watching a film and you're just the only character you've got maybe is doing something terrible, like trying to sink a car with a body in the boot, and now the car isn't sinking, and suddenly you find yourself going sink, and yet you don't want it to sink. You want them to be caught because they're a bad person. So I thought I'd try that on a short story. I'd make a terrible person and just see how long it took for everyone to nope out. Everyone to say, "No, this is awful. I'm not reading this," and nobody did. So I just kept on going.
Well, at the end of every podcast, we like to ask our guests the same questions, and the first of which is, what was the last book?
Last book I read was The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by, I will butcher his name here, Kuri Mukami or something like that, the Japanese writer that's been translated into English. And it's literary fiction. Someone on my Patreon had said it was their favourite book, and I thought, I'll give it a go. And I'm currently reading Will of the Many by James Islington, which is enjoying a lot of success at the moment. And has such an incredibly high average rating on Goodreads that I thought, I need to read this to find out why it's being so successful.
And what about the last film that you saw?
I think it was probably... I certainly know I just recently binged the Planet of the Apes series. I'd never seen them before, but I watched them all because the latest films come out, and I thought I would go and see that in the cinema while I was on holiday here. So I'm planning to see that in the near future. So it was probably the third one in that.
Yeah, it's a very good trilogy. I enjoyed that. And TV show?
I'm rewatching Dexter, which, again, I think I probably watched the first time around about the time I was writing Prince of Thorns. So you again got someone who's doing terrible things, and yet because we're seeing everything through his eyes, suddenly we're wanting this serial killer not to be caught, which is very strange. And I was intrigued by the power of that vibe.
Mm-hmm. And then the very, very last thing that we do on the podcast is Quickfire, either or. So I'll start with RPGs or board games.
Oh gosh, I mean that's so finely balanced. I'll say board games because I've recently got into them.
Okay. TV or cinema?
TV. I very rarely go to cinema.
Night owl or early bird?
Night owl.
And music or no music when you're writing?
Music, but it's generally to block everything out.
Yeah. And this one is my co-host would normally ask this one. A paper book or an e-book?
All paper. I don't get on with it. I'm very easily distracted, so if I'm reading, and I don't have a Kindle, so if I read an e-book on a laptop, I find myself doing something else. So paper is the only way I'll stay focused.
And can we do a quick survey just to rub it in Tarek's face? Paper book or e-book? Hands up for paper book. That's an overwhelming victory for paper book. Good. Well, thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you.
That was great.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Well, Marco, I have to say, I have listened to that episode now, and it was shite. No. Genuinely, it was really, really bad. No, I'm just being an arsehole. It was really good. It was a really good interview. Really nice audience. Mark Lawrence, a lovely man,
and the audience siding with the right side on the paper book.
Hard to know for sure because there's no visuals, but
I mean,
we'll call it a draw.
Yeah, there are some people in the audience. Nick Binge was in the audience. He can speak to it as being truly what happened there. But anyway, no. But I
that was a really, really good episode.
Yeah, it was really interesting speaking to Mark, and really interesting that he doesn't plan his books at all. When you're writing, especially fantasy, that has all these big worlds and everything, to be able to just do it without planning at all is incredible. And I suppose he's right in a sense when he says that he can never write himself into a corner because ultimately he is God in that world. Yeah. So he can always find a way out of it again. But it's brave, I suppose, to do that. I would panic too much to do that, I have to say.
My worry would always be getting yourself 40,000-50,000 words in and thinking, I've messed this up, I have to lose 20,000 words to fix it. But I imagine the more you do it, the more you kind of have that your brain learns.
Yeah,
innately almost.
I think that's right, and it probably sees issues that might arise in the
I think it must do, and
you
even start thinking about, I'll drop little bits here to set that up later on, and that will start to come instinctively. I think, which is nice. But yeah, certainly a mad. But if you chat to a few folk who don't plan much, and not that many who write fantasy books, so I feel that it's one thing to write a thriller or something, but to write a massive trilogy type fantasy without planning it, it's basically what they did with the last Star Wars films, and look how they turned out.
Yeah, exactly. Fortunately, he is better at it than Lucasfilm or Disney. But actually, you say that fantasy authors not planning, and that we haven't spoken to many. But funnily enough, next week we have someone that does
very good segue.
The same thing.
Very nicely done. Yes, next week we're chatting with the wonderful Deborah Harkness, who has written the All Souls series of books, which is A Discovery of Witches is the first one.
Yep.
A very famous book, did incredibly well when it came out, was adapted by Sky into a very successful TV show. And she's really great fun to chat with. Just, lot of really good advice, loves chatting about the process of writing, the kind of ins and outs of it, the techniques, etc. It's just a really nice chat. She's a really nice person, and it's wonderful. Yeah,
it was a really fun chat, and she was very keen to talk about writing, which is great for us, I guess, as a writing podcast. And interesting that she didn't ever have ambitions to write fiction until she went on a rainy holiday and went into a bookshop, and suddenly something caught her eye, and that was her off.
That's
and
right.
Now she's obviously massively successful. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please do take time to rate and review us on your favourite podcast app, as that always helps us to get more people listening, which helps us to get more guests on the podcast.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us an email. Perhaps you were there at Cymera and you want to confirm or deny these ludicrous allegations that I'm hearing today. So send us an email to podcast@writegear.co.uk. Send us a tweet or a social media message on any social media platform. Just search for @UK Page One. We're on YouTube under Page One Podcast. So anywhere there is people talking, Marco and I are there.
Yes, indeed. But otherwise, have a great week, and we will speak to you next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is @UK Page One, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.